Hi there everyone, welcome to another research presentation. It's been just over a year since I did one of these, so it's sort of good to get back to it. So just as with the last one, this time I'm going to be discussing another paper that I'm publishing in the journal Performance Enhancement and Health. This one is going to be looking at polydrug use and drug market intersections within powerlifting cultures in remote southwest England. So based on the same broader ethnographic fieldwork as the last one, but this time this paper is going to focus specifically on what polydrugs powerlifters use, what their narratives are around the use of these polydrugs, and whether that's more on the medicine side, whether it's more on the illicit drug side. It's looking at those intersections between steroid use and the use of other drugs and the cultural narratives which enforce drug use within these communities. So this presentation, this is going to focus on the first of those two parts because it's an 8,000 word paper. So I'm going to specifically focus on the polydrug use within this presentation, and then the next one that I upload in a few days' time, we're going to go through the second half of the paper, which looks at drug market intersections and sort of overlap between steroid markets and other illicit drug markets. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. And as I said, this one again is coming from the journal Performance Enhancement and Health. So I will leave a link in the description if anybody wants to go and read the full article. So to introduce this topic, there's been a growth in the use of performance and image enhancing drugs within sort of the general population in the UK. It's transferred from a small subset of sportsmen and sort of specific subcultures to become much broader. And within this context, there's been a lot of interest in recent years on what are the possible harms to public health that could come from this, and what kind of harm reduction policies can we formulate in order to address some of the problems that might arise from an increase in steroid and other enhancement drug use. So there's been a few writers commenting on this over the past few years, and of course my work, I have talked about this as well. But one aspect which needs to be explored in the context of talking about image and performance enhancing drug using cultures is actually that IPEDs aren't necessarily the only risk of harm within these cultures. So there are specific harms related to the use of steroids, related to the use of other enhancement drugs. But actually, if these drug users are engaged in polydrug use with different medicines, with different illicit drugs and so forth, are there polypharmic effects that need to be understood, or are there just harms that inherently come from their simultaneous use, which might not necessarily be owing to polypharmacy, but owing to sort of the cultural user practices within these populations? So Sago et al. Did a meta-analysis looking at the existing research into polydrug use within IPED using populations and sort of areas that might need to be explored. And subsequent to this, we've had some more in-depth research which examines these areas. So Zanau et al. Looked specifically at stimulant use within different IPED using populations and analysed the different levels at which they're engaged in potential harmful polypharmic use of different stimulants. And this tended to correlate most to, as you'll see in my research as well, the sort of IPED users who follow a more YOLO type topology, to follow Christensen et al.'s work, but that sort of nighttime economy oriented culture who want to look good, but also want to party, want to go out and enjoy themselves. And of course, I've talked about that group on this channel before, and I will address them more in this piece. But Mike Salinas and his colleagues pointed to actually there's a lack of the real in-depth kind of cultural research examining polydrug use that we see for steroid use. There's a lot of ethnographic work, there's a lot of really good qualitative work looking at steroid use, patterns of steroid use and supply. And Salinas and his colleagues sort of say there needs to be that level of exploration looking at polydrug use and the context of polydrug supply and what market structures are within IPED user cultures and where there might be market overlaps. And this is actually essential to informing effective harm reduction strategies, is to have this full cultural understanding of polydrug use and markets, polydrug market overlaps. So my paper essentially builds on the framework outlined by Salinas et al. And looks to explore both those two areas in depth, specifically focusing on powerlifting culture in the Southwest. So it's looking at hardcore gyms and powerlifters training in commercial gyms, and it's also framed by this is a remote rural area, so it gives us perhaps a slightly different insight in terms of market structures. So as I said, market structures, we're going to cover that in the follow-up presentation, which I'll be uploading shortly. But for now, we're going to look at polydrug use within powerlifting cultures and the narratives around the use of polydrug use among powerlifters in the Southwest. So in terms of the research methodology, as I said, in relation to sort of the type of work that Salinas recommends we have more of, this was an in-depth ethnography, and it was based on my observation, my participation in a range of gyms in Southwest England. If you've been following my channel at all, you'll be familiar with the methods. So I examined both hardcore gyms and commercial gyms, all based in the Southwest, and explored them in a variety of both small towns and, of course, cities. The city, of course, being Plymouth. I have tried to anonymise it on occasion, but it's fairly obvious which city it is, just because it's the only city close to that population when you get into the remote portions of the country. So that's sort of the background to the location, and of course, as I said, the focus in this presentation is going to be on powerlifters. So in terms of the type of data that was generated, I have spent a 10-year period in gyms, starting from December 2009 was my first, and I began regularly training in summer of 2010, participating in powerlifting culture. I've done 2 powerlifting competitions myself. I've had a lot of friends over the years very much involved in this culture, both competitively and sort of just as a kind of a leisure activity or a what they do to fill their free time. So in that period, I've had thousands of conversations. I've got masses of kind of personal anecdotes and observational experience, which I draw on. But as well as this, I conducted 18 in-depth interviews with people who I thought would be knowledgeable about IPED use or supply contexts. So this included a couple of commercial suppliers. It included gym owners, personal trainers, competitive powerlifters, non-competitive powerlifters, that sort of thing. So quite a broad knowledge range, bringing insight to the findings in this presentation. And as well, I drew on some online research, both on lifting forums, bodybuilding forums, fitness forums, as well as social media posts, to sort of triangulate my local market findings with broader knowledge of what's going on online and sort of what's being posted by these powerlifters on Facebook and other social media. So to some extent, you could call it a connected ethnography. And of course, there's precedent for that kind of work in Alexandra Hall's work with Georgios Antonopoulos. And in terms of my sort of approach to analysis and my epistemological approach to research, I follow the grounded theory approach of actually trying to generate things bottom up, as opposed to try and fit my findings to a certain theory or paradigm. So with that covered, let's move into the actual findings of my research in relation to polydrug use among powerlifters. So before we get into exploring more of the illicit drug and medicine side of polydrugs, I think it's quite important just to have a brief discussion of alcohol, because powerlifters' relationship with alcohol in many ways, I think, frames actually how they interacted with other polydrugs, and is a clear example of sort of the narratives that we see coming through in other aspects of polydrug use and research participants' responses. So the first thing was actually this idea of alcohol abstinence, and a few of the powerlifters I spoke to commented on not drinking either at all or trying to minimize the amount they drank. And it's important to keep in mind here that actually there's this distinction drawn in 2 regards, and this will tie in with the polydrug use later. Alcohol, of course, is a polydrug, but sort of how we're broadly using it in this research is talking about illicit drugs and diverted medicines. So in the case of Rich, he was talking about quitting alcohol when he began powerlifting seriously. And I asked him about this, whether this was because, he was using steroids and he was worried about potential polypharmic effects. And his comment was, it wasn't because of the steroids specifically, it was because of the lifting. And you're probably going to get this from lots of people, knowing what's because of the steroids and what's because of just being dedicated. So as far as Rich was concerned, drinking alcohol, consuming alcohol might hamper his ability to train as hard as he wanted, might harm his gains. So he quit drinking actually before he started using steroids, just when he was just doing powerlifting training naturally. But more often I heard narratives regarding actually the potential harms of consuming alcohol when on steroids as being one of the key motivators. So a lot of guys would still go to the gym and drink alcohol, but would be cautious of taking alcohol when they were on steroids. So we have this quote from Martin who says, "I know that when taking orals, and obviously alcohol, it's so hepatotoxic because your liver's got to cope with so much crap. So I just thought it's not worth the risk. So I just stopped drinking." So very clearly there, Martin's saying because he's taking orally active steroids, those are the ones that actually hurt your liver the most. He just decided to stop drinking whilst he was taking those. So there's this understanding around actually what's harmful to performance, informing abstinence, and also what could be potentially harmful for health, informing. And these narratives kind of come together in powerlifters' discussions of alcohol and polydrug use more broadly. So it's important to note, not all alcohol was rejected by powerlifters, and some engaged on certain occasions. So there was a powerlifting competition down in Plymouth several years ago, and after finishing the competition's all over, some of the guys were like drinking, I think it was vodka, they were drinking out of their trophies. So there was, to some extent, some acceptance of alcohol. It wasn't a complete abstinence, as in, this is harmful to the body, it impacts on the purity of my training and so forth. But there was some degree of resistance, and particularly those who were involved in frequent binge drinking and other nighttime economy oriented behaviours. There was a lot of criticism from the powerlifters with regards to them. So this ties in with a broader narrative that comes up when we're exploring powerlifters' discussions of polydrug use, is actually the perceptions that they have of drug abusers. So we have drug use and we have drug abuse. And how do we distinguish between those two? And I've noted towards the bottom of the slide here that actually this is culturally constructed in the same way as it is for IPED use itself. So if you talk to steroid users, they might talk about how much they take, how many steroids they use, and they'll often distinguish themselves from sort of meatheads or gym rats or people considered idiots in the gym who, they don't use it properly, they use way too much, I'm much smarter, I use a much lower amount, right? Now, polydrug use actually falls into the same paradigm of use versus abuse. So what we tend to see when talking to powerlifters is actually they'll be very critical of those who are felt to be abusers. And now this tends to relate mostly to the kind of nighttime economy oriented lads. I've used a picture of these lads. I'll just clarify, I am not accusing them of using any drugs, but they do sort of fit the stereotype as sort of gym going lads who enjoy a night out, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. So but there was a lot of critique among powerlifters of a certain subset of these guys who, as Mariusz described it, I know some people who are on steroids, they go out and get drunk and do fucking coke. You're just asking for a heart attack, basically. So this idea that actually when you're on steroids, when you're using enhancers, when you're using fat burners as well, actually, if you're going out and you're getting absolutely plastered and you're snorting lines of cocaine, that is very harmful behavior. That falls under drug abuse because, you know, of the potential health risks, the chance of you having a heart attack. So there were quite a few powerlifters who actually really condemned this kind of take steroids so that I can go out and party and look good on nights out. That culture was quite heavily condemned among the sort of sportsman subset that I spoke to in gyms. So even though research is showing there's actually quite a correlation between alcohol and stimulant use among IPED users, and Salinas and his colleagues actually covered this in relation to a hardcore bodybuilding gym, which perhaps you would expect to attract more of the sportsmen relative to the kind of lads. Actually, when it came to powerlifters, because they are kind of the most sport focused, I would say, and see my presentations on masculinities for a bit more detail on why I think that, actually they were quite critical of this kind of polydrug abuse that they saw. And this ties in with Zanow et al.'s research, talking about how actually the kind of nighttime economy-oriented subset have the highest risk of stimulant abuse. So with that said, it wasn't just potential harms to the individual that drew critique as being polydrug abuse. So it wasn't just, oh, you're taking alcohol and cocaine on steroids, that could cause you to have a heart attack. Actually, it was also tied in with broader cultural values of this idea of roid rage. And actually, powerlifters perceived that there was a stigma attached to powerlifting culture and to themselves as steroid users because of narratives around roid rage. And there were a few examples came up in the research. Mariusz, who we cited on the previous slide, talked about reading the newspaper, and there was some incident where two guys had gotten in a fight in a club and beat someone up, and they got arrested, and the newspaper said they're both gym users but deny that steroids were involved in their actions. And Mariusz's critique was, why do they always bring in steroids just because the guys are gym users? Why are you even mentioning steroids in the article when they were out in a club and they'd clearly been drinking and maybe doing other things? So this perception that actually, if you're involved in those activities, it's always going to get tied back to steroids in the media and in public perception. So as well as the direct harms of polydrug use with steroids and fat burners and so forth, actually there was also the perception of harm to lifting cultures if people on steroids were involved in those types of behaviours, of course magnified by use of alcohol and drugs such as cocaine. So as Jim says, there's the sort of myth of roid rage, which in my opinion stems from people taking steroids, going out on a Friday night and doing coke, getting in fights, and then it always seems to come back to the steroids rather than other things they've taken, and the fact they generally behave like assholes the majority of the time anyway. And then kind of framing what's a drug user versus what's an abuser, he suggests a competitive bodybuilder will go to the gym, take steroids, eat some chicken, go home to sleep. Whereas a gym rat will go to the gym, take steroids to look bigger so they can go out to the pub and pose in front of people and generally cause arguments. So you can see very much, actually from a perspective, they're all steroid users. They want to suggest that steroid use isn't as harmful as it's often portrayed as being. They find that these polydrug users who combine steroids with alcohol and more of the club drug type things where they might be engaging in fights and so forth, actually that is falling under abuse as well. So there's the harm to the individual, and then there's, does it result in behaviours that threaten the legitimacy of safe steroid users? So those kind of arguments around what is use versus abuse, they very much frame powerlifters' understanding of polydrug use throughout this work. So having covered how abusers are sort of culturally constructed within powerlifting culture, it's interesting to note actually what was considered acceptable use of polydrugs. So the use of cocaine or binge drinking when on steroids, strongly condemned, although again, drinking did occur in certain circumstances. There were occasions where drinking quite a lot was celebrated, but there were cultural narratives around the type of person engaging in drinking when on steroids. So there was this cultural construction around what was abuse and abuse of polydrugs, but there was also similar construction actually around what is acceptable and why is certain polydrug use acceptable. So in this paper, what I wanted to do was not necessarily focus on SERMs or HCG or any of these kind of accessory drugs that powerlifters are all going to be taking as part of their routine of using steroids. As far as I was concerned in the definitions of this paper, those all kind of fall under enhancement drugs. So what I wanted to do was actually focus on those polydrugs that might have sort of recreational or illicit uses beyond the context of enhancement drugs, so we can kind of distinguish them from IPEDs. So as you can see on the slide, the main four that came up, which I think are worth looking at, are benzodiazepines, stimulants, cannabis, and opiates. So those are the four that we're going to explore in turn. Now, the first category that I wanted to look at was stimulant use among powerlifters. because stimulants are actually quite common across gym cultures. So we've already seen the context of sort of lads who go out and they'll take cocaine or amphetamine or MDMA and what have you, stimulants on nights out. But beyond that, stimulants actually correlate quite strongly with gym going cultures in terms of what they use within the gym. So you'll presumably have heard of ECA stack, ephedrine, caffeine, aspirin, and this is used by a lot of sort of gym cultures, especially those who want to lose fat, particularly the image-oriented side who want to look good, are taking ECA and taking other stimulant-based fat burners. So stimulants are sort of inherently tied with lifting cultures. And within that, ephedrine and pseudoephedrine are two. Ephedrine, of course, being one of the key components to the ECA stack. So what's interesting in powerlifters' use is that actually, rather than using them to cut fat, by and large, although there is some weight cutting in relation to run up to competitions, but for the most part, powerlifters aren't that bothered about their body weight outside of specifically looking to do a competition. So what they tended to use these drugs for was actually as a pre-workout effect to improve focus in the gym and hopefully lift more. So early on in my time going to gyms and in the field, one of the participants, Jim, was talking about how he would just buy chesties over the counter, which are a medicine, a chest medicine, obviously from the name, and contained ephedrine. They just were ephedrine. And these were banned a few years ago. I think about 2012, 2013 sort of period, they stopped selling chesties. So one of the other participants, Rich, talked about how actually he started taking Sudafed because he felt that helped improve his focus. Because Sudafed contains pseudoephedrine hydrochloride, so not quite as strong or the same thing as ephedrine, but still improved focus somewhat. So one thing that I thought was interesting is actually when I was out doing fieldwork, quite a few people talked about Jacked, or Jack 3D, some people call it, this supplement that was really popular up until 2012, when actually it was restricted because it has DMAA in. And so they stopped selling Jacked on the shelf. And then out in the field, I would hear numerous people talking about trying to get hold of a pre-workout that was as strong as Jacked, and what pre-workouts now have DMAA in before those get shut down as well. So I thought that was really interesting, how actually the use of these pharmacy-only medicines, ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, actually was effectively serving the same purpose as this desire to find a pre-workout supplement with DMAA. So I've kind of tied that to Ian Bordley's work of looking at this kind of move from legal supplementation and where this slips into perhaps illegal or illicit supplementation, because of course these drugs I've listed here are legal, and kind of that transition that perhaps is made among lifting cultures, which I thought was interesting, because materially in buying chesties or in buying Sudafed, these powerlifters were engaging in the same behavior as these more generic gym users were, just trying to find a strong pre-workout. So where does a supplement become a drug, I think is a really interesting question to explore. So whilst they were condemning this kind of party stimulant use of cocaine and so forth, actually powerlifters were very commonly using stimulants, perhaps not as strong or with as many side effects, although we'll come to on the next slide the other stimulants they were using. But they were using them in a training specific context of taking them half an hour before I go into the gym, and treating it as this is actually a performance aid, similar to their use of steroids and other enhancement drugs. So beyond pharmacy medicines, this actually extended to diverted prescription medicines. So Rich, who I noted as taking Sudafed, actually at one point he was taking methylphenidate, Ritalin, he was calling it, as which is a brand name, of course, as a pre-workout. So he originally got it from a friend of a friend because he was working 12-hour shifts and doing night shifts, and was just finding it absolutely killer. And he did comment on steroids giving him insomnia as well. But he said, and perhaps this was an extension of that, he started to use some of this methylphenidate actually as a pre-gym enhancer, so that it would give him that focus, it would give him that drive when he was so tired from working these long shifts and having insomnia, to actually give him that performance boost. So that was an interesting use of, actually, now we're slipping into these sort of stronger stimulants, which might be seen as having more in common with the illicit drugs. Although, of course, these are kind of mass prescribed, and there's lots of children using them, which potentially is something worth commenting on separately, but perhaps points to they're not strictly that harmful necessarily to be using in this regard. And Robert, who was a gym user who I met in a more of a commercial type gym, he actually commented on knowing somebody who had access to dexamphetamine and was discussing this as an enhancement drug rather than as as an illicit drug. So I found this interesting, someone in the gym with dexamphetamine and using it for performance enhancement purposes, actually, that this is the exact same drug, which if you bought it as amphetamine in a club would presumably come under the condemned use of, like, the lads on nights out who go out and do coke. If you were saying, no, they're going out and doing amphetamine, presumably that in the recreational context would fall under abuse. And yet within the gym context, or within just enhancement context, use of amphetamines in some ways was acceptable use. So I thought it was very interesting, the distinguishment between what is an enhancement drug versus what is a recreational drug, what is use of a drug versus what is abuse of the drug, and actually the kind of cultural constructions that informed this within powerlifting culture. So one of the most important polydrugs that came up, and I think from a harm reduction perspective, this is one of the more important ones to understand, was actually the prevalence of benzodiazepine use among powerlifters, because quite a few of them talked about using benzos, and quite a few of them, they were using them, more than a single one a day. They were using notable amounts. So the real underlying justification that most powerlifters gave for the use of benzos was that they served as steroid accessory drugs, which could offset some of the negative effects from steroids. So I mentioned on the previous slide that Rich was using methylphenidate because he was exhausted from his hard work and from his insomnia. Now, actually, in order to tackle this insomnia, Rich discussed that he was taking diazepam, and this was intended to help him fall asleep so that he would actually be able to get enough sleep in to be able to work and then go to the gym. So he just accessed this from a friend in the gym who sold it to him, which I'll talk about in part 2 of this presentation series. And he began using that to tackle the insomnia. And similarly, he talked about, actually, when using steroids that could give you negative mood effects. In our discussion around roid rage, as I said, most powerlifters resisted this concept of roid rage and said it was kind of people inferring things in from negative behaviours of people who happen to be on steroids. And some of them cited the scene in Bigger, Stronger, Faster, where the guy says something along the lines of, if you're an asshole on steroids, I can guarantee you were an asshole before you took steroids. You're just a bigger asshole now, right? And Rich actually said that he felt as though, taking Valium did help to offset some of the mood issues, mood swings and anger that could be associated with steroids. So even though most powerlifters were resistant to the concept of roid rage, they did acknowledge that certain steroids could give you these anger issues, could give you mood side effects. So as well as tackling insomnia, benzos were used to kind of handle those as well. So very much used as steroid accessory drugs. So quite a few powerlifters actually talked about their use of benzos, and a few sort of talked about using them in a bit more of a recreational context. So even though they were primarily justified on performance purposes, it seems that the sort of prevalence of them within this culture and the normality of use actually meant that this kind of spilled over to using a bit more casually. And in my digital research, there will be some jokes about, oh, I'm clucking, I've not had any Xanax or whatever in X period. So just kind of joking around about their use, which was sort of interesting context, but nonetheless is framed by the reason that they were so available in gyms was because they were used as steroid accessory drugs. And important to understand when we're talking about where does this spill over into more use and into recreational use is actually the strong criticism of what were frequently termed junkies who would use Valium. And a few of my participants, they talked both in the context of opiates, which we'll come to, and benzos, talking about, you know, the homeless or, oh, the, you know, the local scummers and so forth. They're using these drugs and have very negative opinions of them. And yet they're using the same drugs. It's just the contextual framing. I am using these drugs for, you know, a beneficial purpose. These people are using them, you know, for negative reasons. So again, the cultural constructions around good drug, bad drug, very interesting. Now, within the context of the normalisation of benzos in powerlifting culture to offset steroid side effects, actually, it's very interesting that Stavros, who was, I think, probably the highest level guy who I've interacted with in a gym in terms of, you know, a record holder, a national level competitor, he actually was very resistant to benzo use. And on his Facebook, he's posted about a lot more sort of negatives of SSRIs, negatives of anti-inflammatories, if you're a lifter, and the negative impacts these can have. But particularly with regards to benzodiazepines, he said, benzos reduce neuromuscular efficiency and directly make you weak as piss. They are abused unnecessarily by many lifters, and you hold back your progress by doing so. If trend makes you feel like shit, just stop taking it. So again, this assertion that actually most powerlifters who are using benzos, they're doing it to offset the side effects of things like trenbolone. And I have that Trem Rage 2 picture just to illustrate some of the sort of memes and jokes around how the anger issues that trenbolone particularly can cause. But of course, other steroids have side effects like insomnia, which benzos were used to tackle. So Stavros very resistant actually to the use of benzos, but in saying this, of course, is acknowledging their prevalence within his subculture, the acceptance of them among other powerlifters. And of course, it's important to note that he's still framing things purely in performance-related terms. Benzos are acceptable for powerlifters to use because by offsetting the side effects of steroids, they can get into the gym better, they can train better, therefore it helps my performance. And resistance to benzos is not framed from broader harms, it's framed in this same context of actually the reason you shouldn't take them is they are going to hold back your training. So I thought very interesting when we're talking about the understanding of polydrug use within these cultures, that actually even those speaking out against benzo use, this was still very much framed in performance-related terms. So we see this same narrative that we saw in relation to stimulants, actually, that abuse is just use that is of no or low utility to training relative to its risk. Whereas if you are using it for performance purposes or it will in some way help your training, it's not necessarily framed in the same way as being drug abuse. So moving on, the next one was opioids and the prevalence of opioid painkillers that I observed in powerlifting culture and in hardcore gyms. Now, hardcore bodybuilders actually have long used opiates. So if you read Lee Monahan's work, and there's some works before this, so I cited McBride et al., actually they talk about the use of Nubane among bodybuilders in the 1990s and how they used this to train through injury. So there has long been some kind of context to the use of opiates, and actually quite a few studies of different IPED using cultures have observed some degree of opiate or opioid use within them. But what's interesting about opiates, and I've cited it again on the slide, is what I was saying about this perception of smackheads and this idea that there are these opiate abusers, and that's one of the worst things to be. And this pejorative term smackhead was used by about three or four different people in my research, who were discussing, you know, people who they see around town being in sort of poorer regions and you know, sort of looking at some of the working class areas of some of the nearby towns and cities. there are some problems to do with like heroin use and benzo use, and alcohol, of course. But it's very interesting that you know, there was this strong sentiment against smackheads in my research among my participants, and yet most of them actually were opioid users. So again, ties in with this: what is use versus abuse? How is that culturally constructed around ideas of utility and around what is considered acceptable behavior? And as you can see on the slide, I've sort of linked it to Simmons and Kuma's work looking at stigmatism, stigma when accessing injecting services, needle and syringe programs, and the way that IPED users wanted to really distinguish themselves from the opioid users who went in those spaces. So in terms of prevalence, actually quite a few of the lifters I talked to discussed using a variety of drugs. Now, it was mostly codeine, and it was mostly in the case of injuries. You know, one would say, I hurt my shoulder, I tore my trap, something like that. It would be some kind of lifting-related injury, and they would generally be using codeine. And I know one who was taking oxycodone because his grandmother was prescribed oxycodone and didn't like the side effects, so he just took them. So then when he got injured in the gym and he felt he needed some painkillers, he just took those oxycodone. So there was something of a prevalence to use of opioid painkillers to deal with injuries and manage pain so you could keep training when injured. And in terms of the kind of normality of opioids, one case that really stood out to me is actually when I injured my spine, which was about 3 years ago now. I injured my spine doing jiu-jitsu. And one of my friends from the gym, actually, he offered me, he could see I was in pain during the day, and he said to me, "Oh, do you want some painkillers? I've got some painkillers in my bag." And I was like, "Yeah, please," thinking he meant codeine. And it turned out he had morphine sulfate with him. Which is, you know, 60 milligram morphine sulfate tablets, which is incredibly strong. So I didn't wind up taking those, but it's just kind of interesting. This, you know, he doesn't see himself as a drug dealer, of course, doesn't see that as being a negative thing. It's, I've got some pain pills, I'm happy to help you. And of course, if they had been weaker, I would have appreciated that, even if it would technically be framed by, you know, illegality, giving someone prescription meds without having a prescription, and so forth. But again, just the fact that A, he had these very powerful drugs with him that he could offer me, and B, that, you know, oh, we're friends, we train together in the gym, so it's no issue offering you those drugs. I think is really interesting in kind of framing the normality of that kind of behavior. So not saying anything negative against him, actually. I was very appreciative when he first offered me some painkillers before realizing how strong those were. But it does kind of show, I think it is indicative of certain aspects of cultural normality around sharing prescription drugs. So whilst benzos were routine drugs for powerlifters to use, you know, anytime I'm going to take a cycle, you know, if you find that you get insomnia just from using testosterone, and you're using testosterone, you're either blasting and cruising year round, or you're using testosterone for 20 weeks and then you're cycling off. Obviously, you're going to be using benzos throughout that. So benzo use was quite routine, which is why I highlighted, I think benzos are an important one from a harm perspective. But opioids, in a sport where guys, A, get injured quite a bit, but also where there's kind of context around masculinity and the ability to train through pain and discomfort, which is inherent in quite a few gym cultures. Opioid use to continue training when you're hurt, I think, could be problematic in that it's so normalized. But it is interesting the combination of actually these opioids were used for the same purpose as certain IPEDs. So I had a few respondents, a couple of powerlifters who talked about the use of boldenone and human growth hormone, and a wrestler who actually said the same, that these specific drugs were kind of used because they had repair properties. So boldenone was considered a good drug among powerlifters and kind of a good one to cycle anyway. But one of the things that they discussed in that context was it actually really helps you with repair. So if you're taking boldenone as part of your cycle and then you're using opioids on top, as we got this quote from Rich, it's not a permanent fix, but it lets you keep training. So again, opioids have that utility in allowing you to press through the pain and continue to make gains. So just as with benzos, there was actually some resistance to opioid use. And I think the most interesting example actually came from Mariusz, because he was both a powerlifter and competes in powerlifting competitions, but he also was involved in wrestling. And there is a lot of painkiller abuse in wrestling culture, and this was something he really highlighted. So in describing why there was so much use of opioids in wrestling culture, Mariusz said, you wake up and you fucking hurt. You go to bed and you hurt, because he was saying there's no off days. You're always either competing or you're training. So he said, so it's very easy to do it in order to like suck it up and keep going. Not enough people understand how dangerous it is. So Mariusz actually talked about the danger of this, and how his use of IPEDs, his use of HGH boldenone, and as we'll see the next slide, his use of cannabis actually were to try and offset, so he didn't have to rely on opioid painkillers, because he could see the harms it was causing in other wrestlers. So and you can watch my presentation on illicit health on this channel. That's worth watching if you want a bit more detail on that. So Mariusz, as a powerlifter who also was involved in wrestling and could kind of see the harms were of complete normalisation of opiates, actually was pushing back against this use within gym cultures, and sort of trying to avoid the overuse of these drugs. So I think it's very interesting that there was some resistance to opiates, both based on harms within sporting cultures and perceptions of those who weren't using them for any performance purpose. Again, to use that pejorative, the smackheads that were referenced throughout the research. But nonetheless, still commonplace for training through injuries, still guys in the gym who would share them out, still plenty of opportunity to access them. So very interesting kind of cultural narratives around opioids, I think. And as I've noted on the bottom of the slide, they were treated with more caution and skepticism than benzos generally among lifters. Lifters seem to be aware of the potential harms, but as noted, wrestlers not necessarily following that and were tending to overuse. So cannabis is interesting as a kind of outlier polydrug, in that it was more or less used across all the gym cultures that I spoke to. I don't think there were any where cannabis use wasn't prevalent. So whether it was powerlifters, bodybuilders, lads, casual weight trainers, Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners, breakdancers, everybody seems to kind of be using cannabis. And that seems to be kind of fueled by broader normalization. But cannabis use was sometimes framed in these terms of perceived benefits to training as well. So we had Eddie, who he sort of did strength and powerlifting oriented training, but he wasn't actually a competitive powerlifter. And he said, I smoke weed occasionally, just relaxes, chills me out, makes me feel like I can sleep for once. So again, tying in with what we said about benzos and insomnia, cannabis being seen in a similar light. And Jim, who was sort of a larger steroid supplier who I spoke to in the course of this research, he also liked to use cannabis because it helped him to sleep. And then Rose, who was referenced on the previous slide, she actually had a chronic pain condition, and she was involved in weightlifting and powerlifting to actually try and offset some of this, and to help her, rebuild sort of the structure of her muscles and so forth, so that she wouldn't suffer from these issues. But she noted she had had problems with using her own prescribed opiates, where it got to the point where it was just too strong. And she actually started smoking cannabis because she said it was good for pain relief. And between use of steroids and cannabis, actually she didn't need any further pain relief. So very interesting to see those narratives actually still coming through, and particularly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys, sort of to move away from powerlifters. When I was talking to them, a lot of those guys smoking cannabis or taking CBD for the same purposes. So it seems to be prominent throughout gym cultures. But in contrast to some of the other polydrugs, there wasn't really any resistance to recreational cannabis use. There wasn't any kind of, we justify it in these circumstances, but these people who use outside of those circumstances, they're abusers, they're a problem. So actually, we saw a few of them talk about using cannabis recreationally. So Rich here says, I smoked a bit, recreationally. Me and Jim smoked it together a few times. So there is this acceptance of social use of cannabis, which we don't necessarily see with other polydrugs. So interesting to distinguish it in that regard, and that probably ties into broader kind of normative cultural understandings of perceived risks versus perceived benefits. Now I'll jump to the bottom of the slide on this one because the picture is so prominent, but of course cannabis has been prevalent in lifting cultures historically. We have that classic picture of Arnold from 1977 pumping iron, wearing his Arnold is numero uno t-shirt whilst smoking a joint, right? So within hardcore bodybuilding culture, there has long been some acceptance of cannabis, and you can listen to Dorian Yates talking about it. He's also a big advocate of using cannabis to help pain relief, to help repair, to help all kinds of things. So very prominently used and very normal within these cultures. But I think it is interesting to tie these perceptions on cannabis and recreational use of cannabis as a sort of distinct polydrug to broader cultural normalization and sort of the normalization that we've seen over the past few decades, where cannabis has just become this acceptable thing. And why it's interesting in this regard is that actually I had a few of my participants compare steroids today with how cannabis was in the 1990s. So Robert, who was a bit older, he was saying steroids now are like pot was when I was a kid. Having a joint was kind of slap on your wrist type stuff. And I think that's the way that gear's gone these days. And Mariusz similarly saying gear is the next weed. And one of the gym owners I talked to, Stephen, he talked about, a lot of young guys, they don't see steroids as any different to like taking a supplement off the shelf. It's not really a bad thing. So all these narratives around normalization of steroids, I think it's really interesting the way that they were actively linked by a couple of participants to the normalization of cannabis. How there was this clear pattern seen where, hey, what we've seen for cannabis and understanding that some of the harms, some of the risks were previously over-exaggerated. I think that's happening for steroids now. People are beginning to understand that maybe roid rage isn't as severe as it's been represented. Maybe steroids aren't necessarily as harmful. So some very interesting discussions, I think, framing the use of cannabis and of steroids and where those arguments intersect. So in terms of polydrug use as a whole, among powerlifters in my research, these sort of 4 types of polydrug, they actually encompass the main non-IPED drugs, that were used by powerlifters. As I said, excluding things like HCG or tamoxifen and so forth from polydrugs, considering those enhancement drugs, these 4 are really the main polydrugs that were used. So there was some broader use. Martin, who I cited earlier, he had bought some Viagra, for instance. Black market Viagra sort of sourced in the same way as a lot of these guys were sourcing their benzos and even their steroids in some cases. So it's very interesting to break down actually that use of these polydrugs, as you could see, very strongly determined by cultural narratives regarding what was considered abuse, what was considered acceptable use, and this was all grounded in perceived benefits to the person and their performance and their ability to go to the gym and train relative to what the perceived risks were. So these were grounded in broader cultural narratives of bad drug versus medicine, as we saw in the opiate example. Heroin user, very bad. I'm taking morphine sulfate, that's fine. So some of those kind of interesting contrasts, and Ross Coomer has done some work sort of teasing those narratives apart. But actually it's interesting when we contextualize things and we look at it. Powerlifters very strongly condemning abusers, people who were taking steroids, taking fat burners, and then taking cocaine and drinking alcohol. Very strongly condemned that kind of behavior, and yet engaging in some risky behaviors of their own, particularly, as I said, in relation to benzodiazepines. So with all that in mind, that's kind of the context of polydrug use among powerlifters in my research. So let's take a minute to critically discuss sort of the key areas for harm reduction policy to focus on. So even though polydrug use routinely condemned when it was seen to be abuse, actually the normal or the acceptable use of polydrugs within powerlifting culture does suggest some areas where it might be important to focus harm reduction policies because of potential risks. So, as I said, I think the most significant of these is the use of benzodiazepines when on cycle. If you are on a steroid cycle for 20 weeks, or if you're blasting and cruising, you're using a low dose of testosterone, and then you're taking your full stack of steroids, and then you're just staying on testosterone after that. If you're using benzos for that entire period, obviously that is easily long enough to cause dependency, and benzos have withdrawal effects, and they have, negative health effects, and other factors tied into this. So if you're sourcing benzos from black market, grey markets, sort of fake meds, as Alexandra Hall has looked into, the potential for further harms, if they're not what you're expecting, if there's a risk for contamination. I know Michael Evans Brown has done some work on this, and actually the prevalence of new designer benzos, when people think they're just buying Xanax or diazepam, they're getting a different benzo, the potential harms that these can cause. Public Health England recently published on it. So I think there are some issues in terms of the potential for acute harms with this normalisation, but also the potential to create benzo dependencies using for that kind of long period. And similarly, we can see it for opioids, the potential that actually if you're taking opioids to train through injuries, this could actually increase injury risk because you're training when you shouldn't be. Your body's trying to tell you I need to repair, and you're forcing yourself to train. So it could be harmful in that very direct manner, or it could be harmful in that it is a risk for creating dependency on opioids, as we've seen in relation to wrestlers. And I think Chris Bell's documentary on that, Prescription Thugs, talking about his brother's problems, talking about broader problems with opioids. This is in the United States, but Marish was suggesting some problems in wrestlers in the UK as well. We can see some of those potentials for harm. And as I said, the linking to these cultures being based on this idea of masculinity means I will train through the pain, and that makes me tougher. In both those regards, kind of ties in with that. Although very interesting to note the use of steroids to offset the time period needed for repair. And then finally, when I'm talking about this, I noted that for benzos, there's this risk because they're sourced through the black market. But is there a risk from the use of diverted prescription medicines as well, as we tended to see for the stimulants and for the opioids? That actually, because these are prescription medicines and because powerlifters are saying, I'm using them for these very specific purposes, is there sort of moral disengagement whereby actually powerlifters aren't really considering themselves drug users because this is medicines that I'm using? And then does that also present challenges in that they perhaps might not be so responsive to efforts to address those problems if they don't consider themselves to be drug users? And I've noted that this sort of parallels testosterone replacement therapy, that actually as we're seeing this as a growing narrative, the idea of steroids as medicine. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that steroids have to be understood as particularly harmful, because I think that the harms were exaggerated, but simultaneously is the kind of moral disengagement that comes with, but it's just a medicine and it's great for treating loss of testosterone in your 40s, said by a 25-year-old guy. I think that we can see moral disengagement there, and I wonder when it comes to polydrugs such as benzos and opioids and so forth, where that could potentially present challenges as well. So it's important that actually much of the understanding of polydrugs within powerlifting ethnopharmacology actually comes about through these sort of culturally embedded systems of advice and ties in with the drug supply. So as we've seen with IPEDs, people get advised on what they should be using by those who are already using in the gym, who already supply. And it would seem that polydrugs, because of these cultural constructions around them, actually follow a very similar pattern. So with this in mind, if you wanted to tackle this, I think harm reduction policy would actually do well to utilize the existing advice mechanisms that we see in gyms. So steroid suppliers in gyms advise on how you should use. If you have experts who are able to give advice on dangers of polydrug use, could we in some way utilize those? So there's been some discussions of outreach services. I know Aitken and Delalande piloted this in Australia. They had a very knowledgeable bodybuilder. This was in regard to steroid advice, but actually was offering this advice in gyms to anybody who was coming to him. And Kimagord and McVeigh have similarly talked about these outreach services. And of course I have, if you watch some of my earlier presentations. So is there some way we can actually discuss polydrug use and polydrug risks and education in that context? So I've noted, I think particularly individuals such as Stavros, who are already skeptical of the benzo use within their culture, if we could have a properly funded harm reduction outreach kind of program that would utilize people like that, who are high status within the subculture, but who are sort of cautioning about this polydrug use, would that be an effective way to perhaps get information out there that may mitigate harms that could come from long-term benzo use, or perhaps abuse of benzos, opioids, and so forth? And then I've also noted that actually, if we could reach out to GPs and sort of harm reduction services and practitioners regarding overlaps between steroid use and some of these polydrugs that are seen as accessory drugs, so particularly thinking of benzos, but more broadly, are there sort of ways that we could help them to become aware of this is a potential risk based on this research, and therefore is something that may need to be explored, and in your dealings with anybody who comes in for IPEDs, maybe provide service relating to this polydrug use? That could be another path, although, as I've noted, there is a lot of skepticism of sort of the medical community among powerlifters and among other gym users. So perhaps that one would be more limited than actually using members of these communities as outreach workers to deliver this information. But just as a caveat to what I've said, of course, the location of this research taking place in poorer parts of this region, and in a region that perhaps has more sort of issues with drugs more broadly anyway. So Bristol, in brief, I know said that the Southwest has some of the highest use of drugs in the country. The ONS statistics here, they're showing drug deaths as opposed to drug use. So that's obviously not a perfect correlation to the levels of use, but nonetheless is indicative of what is high risk use. And of course, outside of the north of England, where we see most of this harm correlating, the Southwest is in second place after the north. So we're sort of comparable to Yorkshire and Humber in terms of drug deaths. So it could also be that there are sort of geographic and class factors that influence the findings. Perhaps my findings in relation to some of these things, if we're in a region that the prevalence of benzos and opiates is higher anyway than other regions because there's more kind of drug misuse in the area. Does that factor in? Does that affect what's happening in gyms? So that could be interesting to consider, but I don't think necessarily invalidates the findings and the narratives that I've covered. It's just worth being aware of. And then also I've noted that it's interesting when we're discussing harm, if the real harms that we're concerned about, when we see deaths related to benzos and opiates and so forth, it's mostly coming from polypharmacy with alcohol. So is the fact that powerlifters are very critical of binge drinking and see alcohol as harming their performance, so don't drink much, could that offset some of the risk? So that's just another thing that sort of popped into my head, but I thought is interesting to consider the extent to which, yes, they're engaging in high-risk behaviours, but is there minimization of other risks offsetting that? So the same sort of arguments we make around steroid use itself. Yes, they're using oral steroids which can hammer your liver, but they're not drinking, therefore are they offsetting those harms? They're conscious of their health, they're making sure they're drinking enough water, they're taking milk thistle or whatever. Does that stuff actually help? Does that offset some of the risk? So expanding those discussions from steroids to actually look at some of the polydrugs as well. And then finally, I've focused on powerlifters because most of my research was kind of grounded in powerlifting culture, but I was in gyms more broadly, and I did talk to sort of lads, and I did talk to people involved in more of this YOLO type training. And actually it's interesting to compare. So powerlifters seem to be more cautious in many regards than these other IPED users. In my other presentations, I've talked about how they're more measured in their steroid use. They use in lower doses, they think longer term, they do more research before they start using steroids. We sort of see this carry over to polydrugs, where yes, they're using drugs that could potentially be harmful, could potentially be risky, but they're strongly condemning those who are stacking steroids, fat burners with alcohol and cocaine, or amphetamines recreationally, or these other behaviours that would seem to cause harm on nights out. So it's interesting to kind of contrast these two, and actually this really does indicate that harm reduction efforts need to be targeted specifically based on cultures, which Zano et al. Sort of indicate in their work as well, that actually stimulant abuse seems to be much higher in certain IPED using cultures than others. So I tie this back in with my doctoral work, actually my thesis, where I interviewed a member of Lag Culture, Pete, who talks about his friend and says, 2 years ago, my mate had a heart attack on a night out. We all say, like, taking this many enhancers, this many fat burners, your heart rate will be all over the place. He has to go to the doctors every month just to get his heart rate monitored to make sure he's all right. But he still takes steroids, he still takes fat burners, he still has nights out. Is that, is that safe behavior? Is that high risk? Clearly that needs to be targeted in a different manner to warning powerlifters about over-reliance on benzodiazepines and potential risks that could come with black market benzos, right? So different harm reduction policies need to be targeted based on these different user cultures and their approaches to polydrug use. And of course, I've got the example there of sort of the Z's culture and the sort of celebration of going out partying, but also being involved in steroids and fat burners. And the things I've heard around that, Robert, who I cited earlier, talked about, he's noticed, he knows a lot of people at the gym and sort of in the town and that he's based in, and sort of talks about the prevalence of guys who are, they're just in their mid and late 20s, and there's a funeral going on for this person, or somebody has a tattoo in memory of their friend who had a heart attack in his 20s, and he's sort of suggesting, how likely is it that these are all from just underlying health conditions without anything on top, or is it because of the use of cocaine and use of these other drugs? Often it's gym going guys who you would otherwise think would be the healthiest. So I don't have the raw empirical data on that. I know there's been reporting in the Southwest of cocaine is killing a lot more people now. I also saw Harry Sumnall on Twitter replying to this being posted and saying, is there a breakdown on whether this is powder, cocaine, or crack? Because of course, if that transpires to be crack, it doesn't affect the sort of sample I'm talking about at all, who are just powder users. So I don't necessarily have hard empirical data on whether we're seeing deaths in these cultures, but we certainly are seeing higher risk behaviors relating to stimulants in those cultures compared to the powerlifters. So that's all worth keeping in mind. With that being said, I will be in the subsequent presentation to this talking about market structures and risks involved in market intersections and the importance of understanding polydrug markets in the region. So do be on the lookout for that, and I will see you then.